It was 2012, and I was just starting to take backpacking seriously. I'd been drawn to the idea of disconnecting from the chaos of daily life and immersing myself in the solitude of nature. My first trip was supposed to be a simple overnighter in a remote part of the Appalachian foothills. No roads, no people, just miles of trails winding through dense forest. I had no idea how much that trip would shape the way I camp for the rest of my life. I'd planned it meticulously, reading guidebooks and forums, choosing a spot that seemed isolated but manageable for a beginner. I was 26 and in decent shape, though I'd never done anything like this before. Armed with a map, a compass, and my gear, I drove to the trailhead early on a cool October morning. The hike to my chosen campsite was uneventful. The trail wound through thick groves of oak and pine, the ground carpeted with fallen leaves. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke from distant hunters' camps. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached a small clearing near a shallow creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and not a soul in sight. I set up my tent, gathered some water, and built a small fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cooked a simple meal and settled in for the night. The quiet was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of a cricket. I remember feeling a deep sense of peace, the kind that only comes from being far away from the noise of civilization. That peace didn't last long. I woke just before dawn to the sound of crunching footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the steps were too heavy, deliberate. Whoever it was, they were circling my tent. My heart pounded as I lay perfectly still, listening. The steps would stop, then start again, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. Then came a low, guttural grunting, like someone clearing their throat, but more animalistic. It was loud enough to make my skin crawl. I gripped the handle of my knife, my only weapon, and debated what to do. If I called out, would they leave? Or would it provoke them? My instincts told me to stay silent, so I did. The grunting stopped, and the footsteps moved off toward the creek. Through the thin fabric of my tent, I could make out a figure in the faint light of dawn. The man, because it was definitely a man, was tall and thin, wearing tattered clothes. He moved strangely, almost like he was drunk or disoriented. I watched as he staggered down to the water and waded in. For the next 15 minutes, he splashed around, yelling incoherently. It wasn't angry yelling, but more like the excited shouts of a child playing in the rain. The sound echoed through the trees, breaking the stillness of the morning. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I was afraid he'd notice me. I decided to wait it out, hoping he'd move on. When he finally climbed out of the water, he stood on the bank for a while, staring into the woods. Then, without warning, he started back toward my tent. I held my breath as his footsteps circled me again. He paused just a few feet away, so close I could see the shadow of his legs through the tent wall. My grip tightened on the knife. If he tried to come in, I was ready to defend myself. But he didn't. After what felt like an eternity, he walked off into the forest and disappeared. I waited another hour before daring to step outside. The sun was up by then, casting long shadows through the trees. The clearing was empty, save for the trampled grass where he'd walked and a trail of muddy footprints leading to and from the creek. I debated whether to stay or go. On the one hand, I hadn't brought enough supplies to hike back to my car and drive home that same day. On the other, the thought of spending another night in the same spot made my stomach churn. In the end, I decided to move my camp a few miles deeper into the woods, reasoning that I'd be harder to find. The day passed uneventfully. I found a new campsite near a small ridge, well hidden among the trees. The hike had been grueling, but I felt safer knowing I'd put some distance between myself and that man. That night, I built another fire and tried to relax. I told myself the encounter had been a fluke, a strange but harmless man passing through the area. The forest seemed quieter here, more remote. I felt a cautious sense of relief as I crawled into my tent and drifted off to sleep. I woke to the sound of snapping twigs. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the noise was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the underbrush. My heart raced as I listened, trying to pinpoint the direction. It was coming from the ridge above me. I peered out of the tent, scanning the trees in the faint moonlight. First, I saw nothing. Then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of movement. It was the same man. He was standing perfectly still, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. His head tilted slightly, as if he was listening for something. I ducked back into the tent, my pulse hammering in my ears. He must have followed me, though how he'd found my new campsite was a mystery. I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day. The footsteps resumed, this time moving closer. I gripped my knife and tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. If he was dangerous, why hadn't he done anything the first time? Was he just trying to scare me, or was he waiting for the right moment? The steps circled my tent again, slower this time, as if he was savoring the effect. Then they stopped. I don't know how long I sat there, knife in hand, staring at the walls of my tent. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, I heard him retreating into the woods. I didn't wait for morning. As soon as I was sure he was gone, I packed up my gear as quietly as I could and started back toward the trailhead. The forest was pitch black, my flashlight casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of my vision. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I didn't stop until I reached my car. When I finally locked the doors and sat behind the wheel, I felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost nauseating. The drive back to civilization was a blur. Even now, years later, I still think about that trip. I've camped dozens of times since, but I always make sure to stay far away from people. Animals can be unpredictable, but it's the people you really have to watch out for. I've been camping for most of my life, starting when I was around 14. My dad got me into it, taking me on weekend trips to remote spots around New Hampshire. Back then, it was all about fishing, hiking, and sitting around a fire without a care in the world. As I got older, camping became more about solitude, a way to escape the noise and nonsense of everyday life. I always found peace in being out there, away from everyone's problems. But something changed over the years. It's not like it used to be. People bring their chaos into the wilderness now. Loud music, drunken shouting, fights. The respect for the land and each other just isn't there anymore. It's gotten to the point where I avoid campgrounds altogether. That's why I started renting cabins in remote areas. It wasn't the same as pitching a tent under the stars, but at least it kept me away from the crowds. I'd find a place way off the beaten path, bring my gear, and spend a few days fishing, hiking, and just relaxing. The trip I'm about to tell you about happened in the fall of 2019. I was 52 then and feeling pretty burned out from work. I'd rented a cabin in northern Maine, about 20 miles from the nearest town. It was an old, one-room place with no electricity or running water, sitting on the edge of a lake, perfectly isolated. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon, parked my truck at the trailhead, and hiked the 1.5 miles to the cabin. The air was crisp, and the leaves were just starting to turn. It felt good to breathe it all in, to feel the weight of my pack on my shoulders and hear nothing but the crunch of leaves under my boots. The cabin was exactly as advertised, simple and sturdy, with a wood stove, a small cot, and a table with a couple of chairs. There was a stack of firewood outside and a hand pump for water about 50 yards away. I unpacked my gear, set up my sleeping bag, and got a fire going in the stove. That first night was everything I wanted it to be. I cooked dinner on a portable stove, sipped a beer, and sat on the small porch watching the stars come out. The lake was like glass, perfectly still, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt like I could finally exhale. The trouble started the next morning. I woke early, made coffee, and decided to hike along the lake to scout for good fishing spots. The trail was faint, more of a suggestion than a path, but I followed it as best I could. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. A campsite that wasn't on any of the maps. It was small, just a fire pit and a couple of logs for sitting. But what caught my attention was the trash. Beer cans, empty food wrappers, even a busted lawn chair. It looked like someone had been partying out here and left their mess behind. Pissed me off. This was exactly what I was trying to get away from. I shook my head and kept moving, determined not to let it ruin my day. Later that afternoon, as I was fishing from a rocky outcrop, I saw a boat on the lake. It was a small aluminum thing with an outboard motor, carrying 3 guys who looked to be in their 20s or 30s. They were loud, laughing and shouting as they tossed empty beer cans into the water. I tried to ignore them, but they spotted me and started hollering, making crude jokes I won't bother repeating. I didn't respond, just packed up my gear and headed back to the cabin. I thought that would be the end of it. That night, as I was sitting by the fire inside, I heard voices. First, I thought it was my imagination, but as I sat there, straining to listen, I realized the voices were real, and they were getting closer. I killed the lantern and moved to the window, peeking out through the curtain. In the moonlight, I could see them, 3 figures walking up the trail toward the cabin, flashlights bobbing in their hands. It was the guys from the boat. My stomach dropped. I couldn't think of a good reason for them to be out here, especially this late. They were talking and laughing, clearly drunk. One of them carried a cooler, and another had a speaker blasting music. I stayed perfectly still, hoping they'd pass by, but they didn't. They stopped right in front of the cabin. One of them yelled something, but I couldn't make out the words over the music. Another banged on the door. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know if they were just messing around or if they had worse intentions, but I wasn't about to open that door to find out. After a few minutes, they seemed to lose interest. They wandered off down the trail, their laughter fading into the night. I waited a long time before I let myself relax. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my gear, cleaned the cabin, and started the hike back to my truck. I didn't want to risk another run-in with those guys. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see them coming up behind me. The forest felt different, less welcoming, more oppressive. Every snap of a twig made me jump. When I reached the trailhead, I felt a surge of relief. But as I approached my truck, that relief turned to dread. The windshield was smashed. Beer bottles littered the ground around it, and the tires had been slashed. A crude message was scratched into the paint on the driver's side door. "Go home." I stood there, stunned. My phone had no signal this far out, and the nearest town was miles away. I had no choice but to start walking. It took me the better part of the day to reach a ranger station. When I explained what happened, the ranger nodded grimly. He said they'd been having trouble with groups like that. People who thought the wilderness was their personal playground with no regard for anyone else. The rangers eventually found my truck and towed it back to town. The damage was extensive, and the repairs cost more than I care to admit. I haven't been back to that cabin since. Hell, I haven't been on a camping trip at all. It's not the wilderness I'm afraid of, it's the people. It was late August, 2015, and my sister Rachel and I had planned a weekend camping trip deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The area was known for its dispersed camping spots, Remote, no facilities, and best of all, free. It was just the kind of solitude we both needed after months of hectic schedules. Rachel and I weren't alone, though. Between us, we had 2 dogs, Scout, my blue heeler, and Luna, her Norwegian elkhound. Both were good dogs, loyal and well-behaved, but they couldn't have been more different in temperament. Scout was calm and steady, rarely barking or showing signs of aggression. Luna, on the other hand, was high energy and fiercely protective of Rachel. Together, they made us feel safe no matter where we went. We arrived at the campsite just after noon. The dirt road leading to the area was rutted and rough, flanked by tall pines and the occasional rock outcropping. The campsite itself wasn't much. A flat patch of earth surrounded by trees, with a fire pit made of stacked stones that previous campers had left behind. We were alone as far as we could tell. The plan was simple. Spend the first night just us and the dogs, and our boyfriends, Mark and James, would join us the next day. We parked the car, unloaded our gear, and started setting up the tent. It was a cloudless day, the kind where the sun felt warm on your skin, but the shade of the trees kept things cool. That's when they showed up. 2 men, maybe in their early 30s, came walking up the dirt path that led past our campsite. They were dressed casually, jeans, hiking boots, and flannel shirts, and each carried a backpack. At first glance, they looked like typical campers, but something about them immediately felt off. The dogs were the first to react. Scout, who rarely showed aggression, froze, his hackles rising along his back. He let out a low, rumbling growl that I could feel more than hear. Luna was even more intense. She stood between us and the men, her ears pinned back and her teeth bared in a snarl. The men stopped about 20 feet from us. They didn't move closer, but they didn't turn away either. I felt a prickle of unease. There was nothing outright threatening about them. They hadn't said anything yet, hadn't made any moves, but their presence felt wrong. Finally, they backed off, muttering something to each other as they walked away. Scout and Luna didn't stop growling until the men were well out of sight. We brushed it off at first. Maybe they were just passing through, curious about who else was camping in the area. But as the afternoon wore on, we noticed them again. They weren't close this time, but we kept catching glimpses of them through the trees. They'd appear in the distance, walking past our campsite, only to disappear a few minutes later. The dogs stayed on high alert, pacing the edge of the site and sniffing the air. There were no bathrooms or marked trails in the area, so their constant movement didn't make sense. They weren't gathering firewood or looking for a good camping spot. They were just there, circling. As night fell, the sense of unease grew stronger. We kept the fire going and stayed close to the dogs, who remained restless. Scout, in particular, kept staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. His ears perked as if he was listening for something. We debated leaving, but it didn't feel right to pack up and drive down those rough roads in the dark. Instead, we decided to stay alert and wait it out until morning. Around midnight, Scout started growling again. This time, it was louder and more insistent. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The beam of light illuminated only trunks and branches, the occasional glint of pine needles, but no movement. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The night stretched on, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. Rachel and I barely slept, taking turns keeping an eye on the campsite. The dogs never fully settled, their ears twitching at every sound. Morning came, and with it, a sense of cautious relief. The sunlight made everything feel safer, less menacing. Still, we couldn't ignore what had happened. We decided to wait for Mark and James before making any decisions about staying another night. The day passed without incident. We kept busy, hiking a short trail nearby and letting the dogs explore. But the tension never fully left. Every so often, we'd glance around, half expecting to see those men again. Mark and James arrived late in the afternoon, their truck kicking up a cloud of dust as it pulled into the campsite. We felt an immediate sense of security with them there. They were both outdoorsy, capable guys who wouldn't hesitate to handle trouble if it came our way. That evening, we built a bigger fire and cooked a proper meal. For the first time since we arrived, I started to relax. The dogs seemed calmer too, lying by the fire with their heads resting on their paws. But just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Luna perked up. She lifted her head, her ears swiveling toward the trees. A low growl rumbled from her throat, and Scout quickly followed suit. Mark and James noticed immediately, standing up and scanning the perimeter of the campsite. They didn't see anything, but they didn't brush it off either. We decided to keep the fire going all night, taking shifts to stay awake and watch. The men didn't come back, or if they did, they stayed far enough away that even the dogs couldn't pick up on them. By morning, the tension had eased again, and we all agreed it was best to pack up and leave. As we loaded the car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But the forest was still, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. We never saw those men again. On the drive home, we talked about what had happened, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they were just harmless drifters, weird but ultimately not dangerous. Or maybe they had bad intentions but were scared off by the dogs and the arrival of Mark and James. Whatever the case, I couldn't shake the sense that we had narrowly avoided something terrible. Those men weren't just wandering campers, they were predators, sizing us up. And if it hadn't been for the dogs and the timing of our boyfriend's arrival, I'm not sure how the weekend would have ended. Even now, years later, the memory sticks with me. I still camp, but I'm more cautious now. I trust my instincts and my dogs without question, because sometimes the danger isn't in the wilderness itself, but in the people you might meet out there. I've spent countless nights in the woods, either in my tent or a rented cabin when the weather didn't cooperate. Over the years, I've learned to handle just about every situation. Unexpected storms, encounters with wildlife, even the occasional oddball fellow camper. But nothing prepared me for what happened one particular weekend at a remote cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains in the fall of 2019. I was taking a much-needed break from work. At 34, I'd been grinding harder than I cared to admit, so a solo getaway seemed like the perfect way to reset. I rented a rustic cabin through a small outfitter, the kind of place designed for minimalists. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a lantern, and an old-fashioned pump well about 20 yards from the cabin. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a forested valley, and the nearest neighbor was at least a half-mile away. The first day went as expected. I arrived mid-afternoon, parked my car at the base of a dirt access road, and hiked the mile and a half up to the cabin. The air was crisp, the leaves just beginning to turn. The cabin itself was as advertised, a one-room wooden structure with a small porch and a simple outhouse tucked into the trees behind it. I spent the afternoon chopping some firewood and setting up my gear. I'd brought enough supplies for 3 days: water, a cooler with some food, and a book I'd been meaning to finish. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit the wood stove and settled in for the night. It was quiet in a way that only the wilderness can be. I could hear every crackle of the fire, every rustle of the wind in the trees. It was peaceful, but there was also that slight edge of unease that always comes with being alone in the middle of nowhere. The first night passed without incident. I slept deeply, waking only once when I thought I heard a distant noise, something like a faint shout, but I convinced myself it was the wind and drifted back to sleep. The second day, I decided to explore the area. There were no marked trails near the cabin, but the outfitter had mentioned an old logging road that wound through the forest. I followed it for a couple of miles, enjoying the solitude and the occasional glimpse of deer or wild turkeys. Around mid-afternoon, as I was making my way back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. A man was sitting on a boulder just off the road, maybe 50 yards ahead. He was dressed in work boots and a flannel shirt, with a weathered hat pulled low over his face. I wasn't expecting to see anyone out here, but I figured he was probably a hunter or another hiker. As I got closer, I nodded in his direction, but he didn't respond. He just sat there, staring off into the trees. I didn't want to intrude, so I kept walking, though I couldn't shake the feeling that his posture was a little off. It wasn't just relaxed, it was too still, almost like he was frozen. By the time I reached the cabin, I'd mostly shrugged it off. It was a little strange, sure, but not enough to ruin my day. I stoked the fire and cooked an early dinner, trying to enjoy the quiet. As night fell, the unease crept back. Every sound outside felt amplified. The crunch of leaves, the hoot of an owl, even the occasional groan of the cabin's wooden beams as they settled in the cold. I tried to distract myself with my book, but my focus kept slipping. Around midnight, I finally climbed into my sleeping bag and turned off the lantern. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the fire die down and the forest settle into its nighttime rhythm. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a scream. It was distant but unmistakable, a high-pitched, guttural yell that echoed through the trees. My heart shot into my throat. I sat up, straining to listen. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but there was something too human about it. The scream came again, closer this time. It wasn't just a scream, it was angry, almost like someone was shouting in rage. I froze, my mind racing. Was someone hurt? Lost? Or was this something else entirely? I debated going outside to look, but the thought of stepping into the pitch-black woods with nothing but a flashlight didn't sit well with me. Instead, I waited, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. Every 20 or 30 minutes, the scream would erupt again, each time seeming to come from a slightly different direction. Sometimes it was far away, other times it felt like it was just beyond the tree line. I barely slept that night. I sat by the wood stove with my flashlight in one hand and a camp knife in the other, jumping at every creak and rustle. By dawn, the screams had stopped, and the forest was eerily silent. I decided then and there that I wasn't staying another night. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, skipping breakfast and leaving the cabin in a state of half disarray. The hike back to my car was tense. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves had me spinning around, but I didn't see anyone or anything. When I finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly laughed out loud. I reported the incident to the outfitter when I returned the key. The guy behind the counter frowned and said he hadn't heard of anything like that in the area before. He promised to check it out, but I could tell he thought I was just another city dweller spooked by the woods. Even now, years later, I can still hear those screams in my head. I've been back to the wilderness since, but I've never returned to that cabin. Whatever was out there that night, I don't care to meet it again. The cabin was supposed to be my retreat. I had just gone through a tough few months, work stress, a breakup, and that general sense of burnout that comes from feeling like life is spiraling out of your control. I needed space to breathe, away from the city and everyone in it. I thought a remote cabin in the woods of northern Minnesota, far from my usual surroundings in Chicago, would be the perfect escape. It was late October 2022 when I found the listing online. The pictures showed a small, rustic cabin tucked in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. It had everything I wanted: no neighbors, no Wi-Fi, and no distractions. The reviews were mostly positive, but a few mentioned that the road leading to the cabin was rough and the area felt too isolated for their taste. That sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive up was long but uneventful. By the time I reached the last stretch of dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows through the trees. The road was rougher than I expected, full of potholes and uneven patches, but I managed to navigate it in my Subaru without too much trouble. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the photos, a small, single-story building with a sloped roof and a wraparound porch. There was a fire pit out front and a stack of wood neatly piled against the side. I parked, unloaded my gear, and took a moment to soak in the quiet. No cars, no voices, no city hum, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The inside of the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with a surprisingly modern composting toilet. The windows were large, letting in plenty of natural light, but they also gave me an unsettling sense of being exposed. Still, I told myself it was just the city paranoia talking. That first night was peaceful. I made dinner, read a book by the wood stove, and went to bed early. The silence was almost unnerving at first, but I eventually drifted off, lulled by the crackle of the fire and the faint chirping of crickets outside. The next morning, I woke to bright sunlight streaming through the windows. I decided to explore the area a bit, hiking the trails that wound through the woods around the cabin. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched satisfyingly underfoot. I didn't see another soul all day, which was exactly what I wanted. It wasn't until I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon that I noticed something strange. The first thing that caught my eye was a small stack of rocks near the fire pit. I hadn't placed them there. They were carefully balanced, almost like a little cairn, and they definitely weren't there when I left that morning. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they'd been there all along, and I just hadn't noticed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been on the property while I was out. That night, I locked the door and checked the windows twice before going to bed. I lay awake for hours, listening for any sound out of place. The woods were eerily quiet, with none of the usual night sounds I'd heard the night before. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I fell asleep. The next day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I spent the morning chopping some wood and tidying up the porch, trying to shake off the unease from the day before. Around midday, I noticed something else. A single footprint in the dirt near the side of the cabin. It was faint but clearly human, and far too large to be mine. This time, there was no brushing it off. Someone had been here and they'd been close. My mind raced through the possibilities, maybe a hunter or someone hiking through the area. But the nearest other cabin was miles away, and I hadn't seen any signs of other people on the trails. I spent the rest of the day on edge, constantly glancing over my shoulder. By evening, I'd convinced myself I was overreacting. Whoever it was, they were probably just passing through. I made dinner, tried to read, and eventually crawled into bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like someone walking through the leaves. I froze, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, then stopped, replaced by the creak of the porch steps. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tense, as I heard the faintest sound of movement near the front door. Then it stopped. For what felt like hours, I listened, but there was nothing. Finally, I worked up the courage to get out of bed. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left by the nightstand and crept to the window. The porch was empty. The next morning, I found more footprints. They circled the cabin, leading off into the woods. My nerves were shot by this point, and I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed up as quickly as I could and loaded everything into the car. As I drove down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow between the trees felt like a figure, every rustle in the underbrush like someone following. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything, the rocks, the footprints, the sounds in the night. The deputy I spoke to nodded gravely and took down my information, but I could tell he thought I was just a jumpy city person. Before I left, he gave me a piece of advice. Next time, pick a spot with neighbors. I never found out who was out there or what their intentions were. But one thing is certain, I'll never book a cabin that remote again. I've always been someone who enjoys getting away from it all. Over the years, I've found that the farther I am from the grid, the more alive I feel. So, when my friend Brian suggested we spend a weekend in a remote cabin he'd rented deep in the national forest, it didn't take much convincing. The place wasn't on any official camping site or part of a state park. Brian had found it through some obscure online listing. The photos showed a simple wooden structure with a tin roof, surrounded by towering pines, with no other signs of civilization in sight. It sounded perfect. It was late October, just as the leaves were turning and the weather was crisp but not freezing. We packed light, just enough supplies for a couple of days, some basic tools, and a rifle for protection. Brian had a habit of bringing a firearm whenever we went off-grid, not out of paranoia, but more as a precaution against wildlife. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through narrow dirt roads that seemed to go on forever. The further we went, the more isolated it felt. Cell service had cut out an hour ago, and we hadn't passed another car in miles. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The cabin itself was smaller than I'd expected. It had a single room with a wood-burning stove, a rickety table and chairs, and 2 bunks built into the wall. The windows were small and grimy, and the whole place smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. It wasn't glamorous, but it had its charm. After unloading our gear, we set about gathering firewood from the surrounding forest. The air was cool and still, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirp of a bird. By the time the sun disappeared completely, we had a decent pile of wood stacked by the stove. We spent the first evening the way we usually did on trips like this, sitting by the fire, eating canned food, and talking about everything and nothing. The isolation was exactly what I'd hoped for. There was no noise, no lights from nearby houses, no distractions. Just the 2 of us and the wilderness. It wasn't until later that night that things took a turn. It must have been around 1 a.m. when I first heard it, a faint rumble in the distance. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sky had been clear when the sun set. The sound grew louder, and soon it was unmistakable. The low growl of an engine. Brian and I looked at each other. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. The cabin wasn't on any marked trail, and the nearest road was miles away. Yet the sound was getting closer. We stepped outside, the cold night air biting at our faces. The forest was pitch black, but the rumble of the engine was unmistakable now. It was a truck, and it was coming down the narrow dirt path that led to the cabin. Brian grabbed his flashlight and rifle. I didn't have a weapon, but I picked up the hatchet we'd used earlier to split wood. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline kicking in. The truck's headlights appeared through the trees, casting eerie beams of light across the forest. It came to a stop about 50 feet from the cabin, its engine idling. The glare of the lights made it hard to see the vehicle clearly, but it looked old, with a rusted grille and a loud, uneven growl. Neither of us moved. I stood behind Brian, the flashlight casting his shadow across the ground in front of him. He held the rifle in a way that left no doubt what it was. We didn't say a word, we didn't need to. Whoever was in that truck could see us standing there, armed and motionless. For a moment, nothing happened. The truck just sat there, its engine rumbling and its headlights glaring. Then, slowly, it began to reverse. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears as the truck backed away, its tires crunching over the dirt and leaves. It didn't turn around. It just reversed down the narrow path until it was out of sight. The sound of the engine faded into the distance until the night was silent again. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Brian lowered the rifle and exhaled. "We should keep watch," he said quietly, breaking the silence. We went back inside and locked the door, though we both knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. Brian sat by the window, rifle in hand, while I stayed near the door with the hatchet. We didn't sleep. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the sense of unease lingered. Who had that been? A lost hunter? Someone who'd stumbled onto the wrong path? Or something else entirely? The way they'd sat there, just watching us, didn't feel like an accident. By morning, we were both on edge. We packed up our gear and decided to cut the trip short. The peaceful isolation that had drawn us to the cabin now felt oppressive, as if the forest itself was watching us. As we drove away, we kept an eye on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the truck following us. But the road remained empty, and we made it back to the main highway without incident. It's been years since that trip, and I still don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just a harmless encounter, someone as startled by us as we were by them. But there's a part of me that doubts it. The way that truck appeared out of nowhere, the way it lingered, watching us in the dead of night. It felt wrong, like we'd stumbled into a place we weren't meant to be. I haven't been back to that cabin since, and I don't plan to. Some places are better left alone. My husband, Paul, and I had planned this trip to Clearview State Park for months. It was late October, and the days were just starting to get shorter. The park was tucked away in the mountains of Colorado, far from the hum of everyday life. It was the perfect place to unwind, quiet, peaceful, and surrounded by golden aspens that seemed to glow against the crisp blue sky. We had rented a small cabin on the edge of the campground, the kind with just the basics: a bed, a table, and a small wood stove. It wasn't luxury by any stretch, but that's what I loved about it. It felt simple, almost primal, to step away from the comforts of home and live closer to nature, even for just a few days. The first day passed in a blur of hikes and sitting by the fire pit outside the cabin. Paul and I spent hours talking, laughing, and soaking in the silence of the woods around us. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the campsite, I felt the kind of exhaustion that only comes from fresh air and physical activity. After dinner, I realized I needed a shower. The cabin didn't have running water, so we had to use the shared shower building a short walk down the gravel road. It was a small, nondescript structure with separate sides for men and women. Paul offered to walk with me, but I waved him off. It was only a few minutes away, and I'd gone alone the night before. Grabbing my towel and toiletries, I set off down the path. The air was cool, and the gravel crunched under my shoes. I had my phone with me, not for the flashlight. I liked walking in the moonlight, but just in case I needed to call Paul. As I neared the building, I saw someone sitting on a bench near the entrance, slumped over with a bottle in hand. His campsite must have been nearby, and it was clear he'd been drinking heavily. He looked to be in his mid-40s, unkempt, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I quickened my pace, hoping to avoid any interaction, but as I passed, he lifted his head and mumbled something. His words were slurred, but I caught enough to realize he was trying to talk to me. I didn't stop or respond. He stood up. My stomach knotted as I heard his footsteps behind me, uneven but deliberate. He was following me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him staggering toward me, the bottle now dangling from his hand. My pulse quickened, and I gripped my phone tightly, my thumb hovering over the screen to call Paul. But I hesitated. Paul had left his phone charging in the cabin, something he always did to save the battery. The shower building was just a few yards away now. I forced myself to stay calm, to not break into a run. Panic would only make it worse, I told myself. As soon as I reached the door, I darted inside and slammed it shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it. The building was cold and smelled faintly of damp concrete. The fluorescent light flickered, casting an eerie glow over the stalls and sinks. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. The gravel crunched outside. He was still there. For a moment, I considered confronting him. I wasn't the type to back down easily, and fear had already started to morph into anger. What kind of person thinks it's okay to follow someone like that? But I knew better than to open that door. I tried to call Paul anyway, even knowing it was pointless. My phone buzzed twice before going to voicemail. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, then shoved it back into my pocket. Minutes passed, then an hour. The building was dead silent except for the faint hum of the lights. I stayed near the door, crouched low, trying to keep myself calm. Every few minutes, I'd peek through the narrow window. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I caught a glimpse of him lingering near the edge of the trees, pacing slowly. I felt trapped, like prey cornered by a predator. Eventually, I saw movement again, but this time it was familiar. Paul. He was walking down the gravel path, a flashlight in hand, probably wondering why I hadn't come back. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't step out right away. I needed to be sure the man was gone. I peeked out the window again and saw the drunk man stumbling back toward his campsite, which was a few plots down from ours. He was muttering to himself, barely able to walk straight. When I opened the door and ran out to meet Paul, I could barely get the words out fast enough. I told him everything. How the man had followed me, how I'd been too afraid to leave. Paul's face darkened, and I could see the tension in his jaw. We decided to report the incident to the campground ranger. The office was closed for the night, but there was an emergency number posted on the door. Paul called and explained what had happened, giving the man's description and the location of his campsite. By the time we got back to the cabin, I felt a little calmer, but I couldn't shake the lingering unease. I double-checked the locks on the door and kept my phone by my side. Paul stayed awake with me, sitting by the window to keep watch. The next morning, the ranger stopped by to let us know they'd spoken to the man. He claimed he'd just been trying to make conversation and didn't mean to scare anyone. They gave him a warning and said he'd be removed from the campground if there were any further issues. It was a frustratingly mild response, but at least I felt a little safer knowing they were aware of him. We decided to cut our trip short. I couldn't relax, knowing he was still just a few campsites away. As we packed up and drove out of the park, I kept replaying the night in my mind, the way he had zeroed in on me, the deliberate way he'd followed. Looking back, I don't know what his intentions were, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that fear like that stays with you. It sharpens you, makes you more aware of how quickly things can turn. Now, every time I step into the woods, I carry a different kind of gear. Not just a map and water, but the resolve to trust my instincts and protect myself if I ever have to. It had only been a day since I left the campground, but I still couldn't shake the unease. What happened there was strange enough to rattle me. A fast food meal left at my campsite, right next to my RV. Someone had apparently sat in my chair during the night while I slept inside. The thought of someone that close while I was unaware made my skin crawl. I told the ranger before I left, but I didn't stick around long enough to hear what he thought. After leaving the campground, I decided to change my plans. I didn't feel like being around people or whatever might have crept into my campsite. So I headed for a cabin I'd rented a few times before in a remote part of northern Michigan. It wasn't fancy, but it was secluded, tucked deep in the woods near Red Creek. The cabin was off-grid. No cell service, no internet, just 4 walls, a roof, and a wood stove. It sounded like the perfect place to clear my head. I stopped at a small-town grocery store on the way and stocked up on the basics: canned goods, bottled water, coffee, and a box of ammunition for my revolver. Being armed gave me a small sense of security, especially after the previous night. The dirt road to the cabin was rough, barely passable in some spots. My truck's tires kicked up a cloud of dust as I navigated the uneven path. The trees grew thicker the farther I drove, their bare branches clawing at the sky. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. I stepped out of the truck and surveyed the area. The cabin looked the same as it always did: small, weathered, and quiet. A single wooden chair sat on the porch, next to a stack of firewood. I unloaded my supplies and carried them inside. The air was cool and stale, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from past visitors. After unpacking, I set about getting the place ready for the night. I lit a fire in the stove, filled a lantern with kerosene, and double-checked the locks on the door and windows. The cabin felt secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, might be nearby. The first night passed uneventfully. I made a simple dinner, read a paperback novel by lantern light, and fell asleep early. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sounds the occasional crackle of the stove and the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning, I woke to find the porch chair moved. It had been sitting against the wall the night before, but now it was angled toward the yard, as if someone had been sitting in it and watching the trees. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to convince myself I'd forgotten moving it. Maybe I had pulled it out for some reason and didn't remember, but something about it felt wrong. I walked around the cabin, checking for signs of visitors. The ground was soft from rain a few days earlier, but I didn't see any footprints. There were no tire tracks on the dirt road except my own. Everything seemed undisturbed, yet the chair nagged at me. I spent the day exploring the woods around the cabin, trying to push the strange feeling aside. I followed the creek for a while, enjoying the sound of water rushing over rocks. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of weather that makes you feel alive. But every so often, I'd catch myself glancing back, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. When I returned to the cabin in the afternoon, I found something new waiting for me. A single, dirty napkin lying on the porch. It was crumpled, as if someone had wiped their hands with it and tossed it aside. My stomach tightened as I picked it up. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen another person all day, and I certainly hadn't left a napkin there. I searched the area again, this time looking closer. Still no footprints, no tire tracks, no sign of anyone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had blown it in from somewhere. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, an invisible weight pressing down on me. That night, I locked the door and windows again and set my revolver on the small table beside the bed. The fire in the stove burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I lay there in the dark, listening to the silence, every creak of the cabin making my pulse quicken. At some point, I drifted off. When I woke, the lantern I'd left on the table was gone. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up and scanned the room. The door was still locked, the windows unbroken, but the lantern was missing, along with the pack of matches I'd left beside it. I checked the floor, thinking it might have fallen, but it was nowhere to be found. The knot in my stomach tightened as I stepped outside. The lantern was sitting in the yard, upright and untouched, as if someone had carefully placed it there. I didn't go back to bed after that. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, stuffing them into the back of the truck without much care. The woods felt different, heavier somehow, as if they were holding their breath. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a small diner and sat down for coffee. I told the waitress I'd been staying at a cabin near Red Creek, and she gave me a strange look. "You're lucky you got out of there," she said. I didn't ask her to explain. I didn't want to know. Even now, back at home, I can't stop thinking about it. The moved chair, the dirty napkin, the missing lantern. All of it was subtle, almost insignificant on its own. But together, it painted a picture I couldn't ignore. Someone had been out there watching me, waiting, and I still don't know what they wanted. I haven't been back to the woods since. When I was in my early 20s, I spent 3 summers working as a camp counselor in the Adirondacks. The camp wasn't anything fancy. It was the kind of place parents sent their kids to get them off their hands for a few weeks. There were wooden cabins scattered around a central fire pit, a dining hall that smelled permanently of burnt eggs, and a small lake where we spent most afternoons trying to keep kids from drowning. It was a good time for the most part. Long days, lots of laughs, and stories by the fire each night. One of my favorite parts of the job was telling ghost stories. It was a camp tradition for counselors to take turns trying to outscare each other, and by my second summer, I had perfected my signature tale. I'd start with a slow build, letting the kids' imaginations run wild, before dropping the kicker at the end. The story itself wasn't anything too creative. It was about a man who had been wronged, cheated out of his land or money depending on my mood, and had come back from the dead to seek revenge. The twist was that he wouldn't stop killing until someone gave him 2 of their teeth and the names of 2 others to take instead. It was a classic campfire story, creepy but not too over the top. What made it memorable was the way I ended it. You see, I have a bit of a dental oddity. When I was a kid, 2 of my adult teeth never came in, leaving gaps in my smile. For years, I wore a retainer with 2 fake teeth attached to fill the spaces. By the time I was a counselor, I'd gotten used to it and rarely thought about it, but it turned out to be the perfect prop. At the climax of the story, just when the kids were leaning in close to the fire, wide-eyed and shivering, I'd casually pop out my retainer, grin, and say, "Guess who already gave up their teeth?" It never failed to send them screaming back to their cabins. That summer, though, things got weird. It was the middle of July, and the camp was in full swing. I had a group of 10-year-olds in my cabin, rowdy but good-natured for the most part. We'd just finished a long day of canoeing and crafts, and everyone was looking forward to the evening campfire. The night started like any other. The fire crackled in the center of the circle, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. The kids were restless, whispering and giggling as marshmallows roasted on sticks. When it was my turn to tell a story, I launched into my usual routine. The kids hung on every word, just as they always did, and when I reached the end, I pulled out my retainer and flashed them my gap-toothed grin. The reaction was perfect. Shrieks, laughter, and a few, "You, gross," comments. I grinned, pleased with myself, and sent them off to bed. But later that night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was one of the boys sneaking out. It wasn't uncommon for kids to try to meet up with their friends or pull pranks after lights out. So I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze, but there was no one in sight. "All right, back to bed?" I muttered, assuming whoever it was had scurried back inside. I did a quick head count and found all the boys sound asleep in their bunks. Feeling a little foolish, I crawled back into bed. The next morning, I overheard 2 of the kids whispering during breakfast. "I heard him," one of them said. "He was outside our cabin last night." "Who?" the other asked. "The guy from the story, the one with the teeth." I rolled my eyes and chalked it up to overactive imaginations. After all, scaring them was the whole point of the story, right? Still, the idea that they were spooked enough to believe it made me feel a little guilty. I decided to tone things down the next time I told the tale. That afternoon, I went down to the lake for free swim. The kids were splashing around, and the other counselors were chatting on the dock. I was halfway through a conversation about the upcoming talent show when I noticed one of the boys standing alone at the edge of the water. "Everything okay?" I asked as I approached him. He nodded but didn't say anything. His eyes were fixed on the treeline across the lake. "Look," he finally said, pointing. I followed his gaze but didn't see anything unusual, just trees and shadows. "What are you looking at?" I asked. "There was a man," he said quietly. "Right there. He was watching us." I squinted, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "There was no one there. Probably just a hiker," I said, trying to reassure him. "This place gets plenty of visitors." He didn't look convinced, but before I could say anything else, one of the other counselors called for swim time to end, and the moment passed. That night, things escalated. After lights out, I was doing my usual rounds when I heard something again. This time, a low rustling sound outside the cabin. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. Slowly, I moved to the window and peeked out. In the moonlight, I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees. He was tall and motionless, his face obscured by shadows. For a moment, I thought it might be one of the older campers pulling a prank, but something about the way he stood, so still, so deliberate, made my stomach churn. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, but by the time I got to the spot, he was gone. The next day, the boys were buzzing with rumors. A few claimed they'd seen the man too, while others insisted it was just a joke. The counselors were skeptical, but I could tell some of them were uneasy. The woods around the camp suddenly felt a little darker, a little more menacing. By the end of the week, I was on edge. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, set my nerves on fire. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I'd spooked myself by feeding into the kids' stories, but the feeling wouldn't go away. On the last night of the session, we held a big bonfire to celebrate. The kids were excited, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. As the fire died down and the kids drifted back to their cabins, I stayed behind to help clean up. That's when I found it. Lying in the dirt near the fire pit was a retainer, exactly like mine, with 2 fake teeth attached. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It wasn't mine. I had mine in my pocket. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows and yell, "Gotcha!" But there was no one there. I threw the retainer into the fire and watched it melt. The next morning, I packed my things and left camp, telling the director I wouldn't be back the following summer. I haven't told that story since.